everyone, welcome back. I'm Bumi and today we are watching The Enduring Mystery of Jack the Ripper Part 2. Yes, if you haven't seen Part 1, it will be linked down in the description, in the pinned comment as well, and there's probably an iCard here if I don't forget to put it there. We covered, I believe, 5 chapters in part 1 and basically saw through 5 unfortunate victims, though we weren't sure if the last 2 were connected with each other. But yeah, I'm just itching to go ahead and check out the rest of the video. So remember, if you like my reactions, don't forget to leave a like. Let me know your thoughts on the video down in the comment section below and consider subscribing. Also, please don't forget to leave your suggestions on what I should check out next, anime or YouTube video. Leave them down in the comments. That being said, let's go ahead and continue the video. Okay, we ended in chapter 6. What was it called? The Work of the Devil?
On the morning of November the 9th, a merchant and property owner named John McCarthy was going through his bookkeeping. McCarthy was the landlord of Miller's Court, and the tenants of room 13 had fallen behind on their rent. McCarthy sent at once for his assistant, Thomas Boyer, to collect the money at 11:15. After knocking twice without response, Boyer went around the corner to peer through a window, but his view was obstructed by a coat or curtain, so Boyer had to reach through a broken window pane to pull it aside. That's when he saw the severely mutilated body of a woman lying upon a bed in the corner of the room.
No. Another one?
Miller's Court was soon crawling with police, but the door to room 13 was locked.
I don't know why I'm shocked,
open with a pickaxe. What they found inside was truly the stuff of nightmares. The sight we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again.
Damn,
Dr. George Phillips described the body as, quote, cut all to pieces. Dr. Thomas Bond described the woman's face as, quote, hacked beyond recognition. The abdomen had been, quote, emptied of its viscera, while the throat had been, quote, severed all round, down to the bone.
Damn,
the body had been so monstrously disfigured, with
yes,
organs dispersed all around.
It got butchered.
The room itself was sparsely furnished and offered little in the way of clues. 2 tables, 1 or 2 chairs.
Is that a door?
Small cabinet. Amongst the ashes of a fireplace, the police
in the bedroom?
Of burned clothing.
Here, near the bed.
Had the killer tried to dispose of evidence, or had it merely been used for warmth and light? The victim was identified almost immediately. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly. And
okay, so this one is in the mid-20s now.
But nearly everything about Kelly's life is shrouded in mystery. She was presumably of Welsh or Irish descent and in her mid-20s, making her the youngest victim by far. But given that no matching records of a Mary Jane Kelly have been found, it's probable that she was using a fake identity. In any case, Kelly had not been living alone. Up until a few days before the murder, she had cohabited with a man named Joseph Barnett. They had only separated on October the 30th because Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution and the people with whom she associated. But they did see each other again. On the evening of November the 8th, Barnett paid Kelly a visit. Upon his arrival, he found Kelly in the company of a woman who was just about to leave. Unfortunately, there are conflicting accounts about who this woman was, when Barnett arrived, and how long he stayed. If we choose to believe Barnett, he arrived at some point between 7 and 7:45 and left before 9 o'clock. Shortly before midnight, Kelly was spotted in the company of a man by her neighbor, Mary Ann Cox. When Cox passed the couple, they were about to enter Kelly's room. Cox bid Kelly goodnight, but she was, quote, very much intoxicated and barely able to respond. Once they had gone inside, Cox could hear Kelly singing. When Cox then left the court about an hour later, Kelly could still be heard singing. By 2 o'clock, Kelly had apparently ventured back outside, for she was spotted by a man named George Hutchinson. The 2 of them were supposedly well acquainted, and Kelly had asked if he could spare a few coins. But Hutchinson was broke, and Kelly was desperate for money, so they soon parted ways. Moments later, Hutchison observed Kelly being accosted by a well-dressed man. The two
Ooh.
of them had a seemingly jovial interaction and began walking north. Hutchison found it suspicious that such a well-dressed man would seek the company of a woman like Kelly. As such, when the couple passed him by, he scrutinized the man's appearance. He was, for instance, carrying a pair of gloves in his right hand and a small parcel in his left.
Again, another
Hutchison decided to
another well-dressed man carrying a parcel or a package. That's the second time that we've heard of that description now.
shadow the couple as they proceeded to Miller's court. Before they vanished up the court, the man handed Kelly a red handkerchief, and she had supposedly told him, "All right, my dear, come along. You will be comfortable."
Another instance of the red handkerchief. If you remember in part one, at least in my video, that there was a description of a man looking like a sailor with a red handkerchief.
Hutchinson remained in the vicinity until 3 o'clock, but neither Kelly nor the man reappeared. At roughly the same time, Cox returned home. In stark contrast to the loud singing upon her last departure, Cox was now struck by the complete absence of sound and light from Kelly's room. Finally, at approximately 4 o'clock, a tenant above and a woman across from Kelly's room heard cries of murder. The voice was that of a woman, and it appeared to emanate from nearby. Meanwhile, other denizens of the court heard no screams at all.
Ooh.
According to
Wow.
Dr. Bond, Kelly died between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Phillips
Again.
placed the time of death a few hours later. But some witnesses were quite adamant that they had seen or even spoken to Kelly as late as 8 or 10 o'clock in the morning.
Again, conflicting time reports. This is not going to be helpful.
Keep in mind that her body was discovered at 11:15. These contradictions are difficult to reconcile, and the precise time of death eludes us to this day. Mary Jane Kelly is typically regarded as the Ripper's final victim. Along with Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, she is part of the Canonical Five. The
Canonical
victims
Five,
most likely
yeah.
to have been slain by the same hand.
Oh, that's right, because I believe Eddowes was the second victim in the double event, right? So the one that just got her throat slashed probably didn't count.
Martha Tabram might have been a victim of Jack the Ripper, but opinions are divided. The same is true of at least a handful of other cases.
Oh, there were
Even
a lot
the Canonical
more.
Five are not without controversy, so the total number of victims is a matter of debate. Presuming that Kelly was indeed the final victim, one has to wonder why. Why did the murders come to such a sudden end? Did a Ripper give in to fears of being caught? Were they imprisoned for a different crime? Perhaps they succumbed to an illness or committed suicide. Could they have migrated to another country? Perhaps they deliberately changed their modus operandi to confuse the police.
That
The
is
possibilities
extremely
are
weird.
virtually endless, which means there is no shortage of suspects.
I mean, it's crazy to say that if you're this successful, I mean, if you're a serial killer of this like success rate, there's a really good chance that you probably won't change. Like you probably get this feeling like being unstoppable, so you're probably going to continue until you get caught. But then again, there are a lot of serial killers who are smart enough to know when their time's up and they just stop.
Following the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, a rumor began to circulate that someone called Leather Apron was in the habit of abusing prostitutes. The name quickly made its way into the press, and soon enough it became synonymous with the killer. In fact, Leather Apron was the predominant pseudonym before Jack the Ripper. But the man identified as Leather Apron was soon cleared of all suspicion. His real name was John Picer, and he was in a different part of London on the night when Nichols was attacked. This misguided manhunt is somewhat emblematic of the whole investigation. The police pursued even the most tenuous of leads due to a lack of evidence and mounting pressure from the public. They interviewed thousands, investigated hundreds, and developed numerous theories along the way. In the words of Inspector Frederick Abeline, "Theories. We were lost almost in theories. There were so many of them."
Damn.
In an effort to narrow down the search, the police used a primitive form of criminal profiling. The idea was to analyze the available evidence to try and gauge what sort of person had committed the crimes. This profile was prepared by Dr. Thomas Bond, and he described the Ripper as a strong, middle-aged man with an inoffensive appearance who dressed respectably. Bond's most controversial assessment was that the killer possessed, quote, "no scientific nor anatomical knowledge." This stood in direct opposition to the opinions of his peers, most of whom ascribed the Ripper with at least a basic understanding of anatomy. Based on the witness accounts, the Ripper was a man of average height with a medium to stout build in his late 20s to mid-30s. He wore dark clothes, including a hat of some sort, and had a mustache. But this sort of aggregation or tabulation of accounts can be quite deceptive. Not only are many details inconsistent, but they could be describing entirely different people. For all we know, none of the witnesses ever laid eyes on Jack the Ripper. So
It could also be that, like, the most predominant description of him is that he's very well dressed. It could be that he has very good clothes specifically for this um this event, I guess, if you could call it that, and then proceeded to wear like poor man clothes during the day for the most part.
So much is up for debate that one can build a case against almost any suspect. Some have even entertained the possibility that the Ripper was a woman or possibly a man disguised as a woman.
Yeah.
While Jill or Jackie the Ripper is an interesting theory, it has failed to achieve any widespread support.
Jill. Oh yeah, like Jack and Jill.
What is
Okay, I
rarely
get
in
it.
dispute is that the Ripper was either a resident of or otherwise familiar with the East End. After all, he managed to narrowly evade capture on multiple occasions, which implies intimate knowledge of byways and patrol routes. He likely had some form of employment, as the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays, and he may have had some degree of anatomical knowledge. With this unshakable profile in hand, let's take a closer look at a few suspects. The question is, where do we even begin? According to criminal profiler and FBI Special Agent John Douglas, the Ripper was not only a local, but was likely interviewed by the police. If Douglas is correct, the Ripper might be someone we've already met. Either.
Ooh, that would be interesting though. If yeah, like I said in the previous video, he could it's very easy for him to blend in with the crowd, especially in that densely populated area of London. So chances are they've already talked to him.
A witness or a person close to one of the victims. What about John Richardson, the witness in the Chapman case who sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot? Richardson was indeed suspected by the police, but they found, quote, "not a shred of evidence" against him. His mother also lived on the premises, so he had good reason to be there. What about George Hutchinson, the witness who followed Mary Jane Kelly after she was accosted by a well-dressed client? Hutchinson never clarified his motivation for shadowing the couple.
Yeah, that's
He
true.
merely stated that
I was
he
wondering that as
surprised
well.
to see a man so well-dressed in the company of a woman like Kelly. Was he surprised because he was concerned? Was he jealous? Was it about money? After all, Hutchinson was broke, and the client appeared to be wealthy. Perhaps he waited outside the court with the intention of mugging this well-dressed client.
Then again, he also knew Mary John Kelly, right? So it could have been just out of concern. But again, we'll never know.
There are many question marks surrounding
What is
Hutchinson.
in my goddamn
He has never
mind?
been positively
Excuse me.
identified, so next to nothing is known about his life. This makes it very difficult to build a strong case against him. Hutchinson was interrogated by the police, but ultimately convinced Inspector Frederick Abeline that he was telling the truth. But not every witness attracted such attention from the police. Take for instance Charles Cross, the man who discovered the body of Marian Nichols. On the morning of August the 31st,
Oh.
Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street and headed for work. When he turned into Bucks Row, he happened upon the body of Marian Nichols. Moments later, he was joined by Robert Paul, and events transpired as previously described. Despite his proximity to the crime, Cross appears to have escaped suspicion from both the press and the police.
Yeah, I was
He
wondering that in the first video that why these two were never suspects, because they were clearly the last person to have technically seen her still alive. So that is sus.
seen as the innocent passerby that he appeared to be. But in recent years, that perception has been challenged. The argument is that Cross was in the act of committing the murder when he was interrupted by the approaching footsteps of Paul. Cross then concealed the murder weapon and portrayed himself as someone who just found the body. The injuries inflicted upon Nichols would be consistent with an interruption, as they were less severe than those of later victims. What's interesting about Cross is that he likely testified under a false name. He claimed to be employed as a carman, and his address was given as 22 Doveton Street. But surviving records show that in 1888, this address was occupied by a man named Charles Lechmere. Lechmere was also employed as a carman, and on at least one occasion went by the name Charles Cross, as it was the surname of his stepfather. It is now widely believed that Charles Lechmere was the man who appeared at the inquest, and that he assumed the name of his stepfather when he testified. His motivation for doing so has been the source of much speculation. Was he trying to conceal his identity, or was it merely a force of habit? After all, contemporary examples of people doing the exact same thing are not difficult to find. The most compelling evidence against Lechmere is that his morning commute between home and work roughly coincides with the time and place of the murders.
Ooh.
Except for the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, who
That's
were killed
interesting.
on a Sunday, the only day when Lechmere would have been free from work.
Yeah.
Not only that, but all the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays. Why would a man who supposedly timed the murders with his morning commute gravitate towards days of rest?
That is true. If he takes this route towards his place of work, then chances are high that he knows this specific route. I should be pointing with my mouse specifically.
In any case, Lechmere's mother lived a few blocks south of Burness Street, the neighborhoods around which is also where Lechmere spent his childhood.
Another
As such, it's speculated that Stride and Eddowes were
another
killed after Lechmere paid a
coincidence.
late visit to his mother. While he claimed to be employed at a delivery firm known as Pickford's, there are no surviving records of his employment. If he did work for Pickford's, there is a fair chance that he delivered meat and would thus have been exposed to slaughter and blood on a daily basis. Lechmere remained in East London until his death in 1920 at the age of 71. While there is no evidence of Lechmere ever being suspected by the police, it is difficult to believe that he was completely overlooked.
Yeah.
Many case files have not survived, so any doubts investigators might have had could have long since disappeared. Now, a witness who definitely attracted attention was Joseph Barnett.
This is the guy that The guy that had what do you call this? I think it was with Kelly.
Joseph Barnett was the man who lived with Mary Jane Kelly
Yeah.
up until a few days before the murder. He and Kelly had
He is an obvious suspect because they basically broke up, which gives him a motive. But then again, Kelly is just the last of his victims. If it was him, so that doesn't make sense. But then again, he could have turned on Kelly at the last minute. This could also be why um the murder stopped after Kelly, because he probably couldn't live with himself having targeted the person that he quote unquote loved. So yeah.
supposedly met around April of 1887, and they eventually moved to 13 Miller's Court. Barnett was employed as a fish porter, but for reasons unknown, he lost his job between July and August of 1888. From that point onwards, the couple struggled to pay rent, and Kelly resorted back to prostitution. Now, those who believe that Barnett was the Ripper view his loss of employment as a turning point. The argument is that Barnett was so overcome with guilt and anguish for driving Kelly back to prostitution that he went on a murder spree, murdering one local prostitute after another
Yeah,
in a desperate attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets. While most of this is pure speculation,
even if it's just speculation, that is a really good motive for doing this. I mean, it's not like good as in good, but it it it, it checks out. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
it is true that Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution. You may recall that Barnett separated from Kelly on October the 30th because he disliked the prostitutes with whom she associated. Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house. This might further explain why Kelly was the Ripper's final and most viciously mutilated victim, the implication being that Barnett felt rejected by Kelly and wanted revenge for the breakup. According to Barnett, he did pay Kelly a visit on the evening of November the 8th, but they had parted on quote, friendly terms. He then supposedly went home, played a card game until 12:30 before going to bed. Now, Kelly is presumed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, so Barnett could have returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. While the police did subject him to 4 hours of interrogation, Barnett was ultimately released without charge. Then there's the matter of the locked door. When the police arrived at Miller's Court, they had to force the door open with a pickaxe. This raised an important question. How did the killer lock the door behind him? According to Barnett, the key to room 13 had been missing for some time. Because of this, he and Kelly would, quote, open the door by reaching through the broken window. The door was said to be equipped with a, quote, catch lock, and evidently locked itself upon being closed. If that's true, mystery solved. But even if the door was not self-locking, there's still an obvious solution. All the killer would have had to do is observe Kelly using the window trick and then employ that same technique to fasten the door upon leaving. But those who favor Barnett as the Ripper offer yet another solution. The key never went missing. Instead, Barnett is said to have stolen the key and then used it on the night of the murder. These solutions are all equally valid, and it's impossible to know which one is correct.
Damn.
There is a slight variation of this theory which states that Barnett did murder Kelly, but was not the Ripper. Instead, he merely emulated the Ripper to deflect attention away from himself. Once again, this is
that could also be,
but the murder of Kelly did differ from the rest in that it was committed indoors. Barnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. While it's only natural for suspicion to fall upon witnesses and acquaintances, Victorian detectives did pursue other lines of inquiry. One prominent theory was that the Ripper suffered from insanity, and a prime suspect in that category is Aaron Kosminski.
Wait, this is the first time we've heard of this guy, right?
The Whitechapel murders investigation was overseen by numerous high-ranking officers within the Metropolitan Police. One of them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Upon his retirement, Anderson repeatedly and unequivocally stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name of the suspect, Anderson described him as a, quote, low-class Polish Jew who was, quote, safely caged in an asylum. He'd been identified by a witness who was described as, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer. This unnamed witness had supposedly refused to testify because the suspect was, quote, a fellow Jew. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course. While Anderson never revealed the name of the suspect, his colleagues were a bit more forthcoming. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson revealed that his surname was Kosminski.
Ooh.
Yet another high-ranking officer, Melville McNaughton, described Kosminski as a homicidal and misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Surviving records show that an Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1891.
That could just be coincidence, though. I mean, at this point, they probably don't have a suspect. They probably felt like desperate just to pin it on someone. And Aaron Kosminski, as described as what he described as had strong homicidal tendencies, would have been a very easy target.
Aaron
Unless if they had
Kosminski
really
was
strong
admitted to a
evidence.
psychiatric hospital in 1891. Aaron was indeed from Poland, he was Jewish, and had lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and a paranoid fear of being fed by others. He was trained as a barber, but had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years. It's unclear when his mental health began to decline, but upon being institutionalized, Aaron was deemed to be harmless. He was, quote, quiet and well-behaved, and, quote, apathetic as a rule. Only on rare occasions would he get, quote, excited and violent. However, before his confinement, Aaron had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against him largely hinges upon the claims made by Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, especially the claim that an unnamed witness identified a suspect named Kosminski. But the descriptions of that suspect are not entirely consistent with Aaron Kosminski. For instance, McNaughton stated that the suspect had been, quote, removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. Aaron was first confined in 1891. Swanson wrote that the suspect had been, quote, sent to the asylum and died shortly afterwards. Aaron was still alive at the time and spent nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. As such, it is possible that the suspect Kosminski was someone other than Aaron Kosminski.
Another
It's also
Kosminski.
possible that these inconsistencies were mere lapses in memory. After all, these events were recounted years or even decades after the fact, and McNaughton even confessed to writing solely from memory. Regardless of the suspect's true identity, Anderson was the only one who seemed convinced of his guilt. McNaughton ultimately favored a different suspect and stated that, quote, many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one.
Yeah,
Inspector Edmund
these
Reed
were
was
just
of the
clean
same
murders.
opinion. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. So when Anderson wrote that there was, quote, no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal, he merely expressed his personal opinion. There was in fact ample doubt and no consensus amongst the police.
Okay, so it was just one
recent
man's
years,
opinion.
Aaron Kosminski has been resurrected as a prime suspect due to a controversial DNA analysis. Okay, so back in
we have
1888,
DNA
Acting
analysis
Sergeant
now.
Amos Simpson is said to have stolen a blood-stained shawl from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes. This shawl was then passed down from one generation to the next before being submitted for DNA testing in 2011. DNA samples were extracted from the shawl and then compared against maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski. In both cases, it was a match. If the subsequent news coverage is to be believed, the mystery has now been, quote, definitively solved. Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper.
Really
But
now?
as you can imagine, it's never
No.
quite that simple.
Yeah.
First of all, the provenance or chain of custody of the shawl is severely lacking. There is no evidence of a shawl being found at the crime scene, nor is there any evidence of Simpson ever being at the crime scene.
There's too much gaps in information to definitively point out a suspect at this point. So it's probably safer to just say that Jack the Ripper just got away.
Furthermore, a destitute woman like Eddowes is unlikely to have owned such an expensive item. Second of all, the type of DNA used to identify Eddowes and Kosminski was mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse of the cell. This type of DNA is passed down through the female line and
Powerhouse
is
of
not
the
unique to
cell.
any one individual. Thousands can share the same mitochondrial DNA, which means it can't be used to pinpoint a specific person. In the words of a geneticist, based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. So to say that the mystery has been definitively
That makes
solved
sense.
is widely inaccurate. There's still plenty of room for doubt. So, to recap, a suspect named Kosminski was identified by an unknown witness. This was enough to convince at least one senior officer of his guilt. That suspect may have been Aaron Kosminski, a man who was largely non-violent but once threatened his sister with a knife. Aaron can neither be incriminated nor eliminated by the DNA evidence. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care and died in 1919 at the age of 53.
Man.
Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by a high-ranking officer. A completely different suspect who still falls into the same category is Francis Tumblety.
Another one? Another new one? I mean?
2 days before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, an American physician named Francis Tumblety was arrested
Excuse
in
me,
London.
guys.
As you
It's
can
very
probably tell from this
early in the
photograph,
morning now.
Tumblety was quite an eccentric character. He was born in Ireland around 1833, but was raised in the United States. From an early age, Tumblety gained a reputation for being a medicaster or quack doctor. He engaged in all sorts of medically dubious practices and advertised himself as the Indian herb doctor. He promised to cure anything from dyspepsia and scurvy to cancer and blindness using nothing but medicinal herbs. When he was not posing as a doctor, Tumblety was busy running from the law. He was either accused or convicted for crimes like theft and assault, attempt to induce a miscarriage, and manslaughter of a patient. He was even implicated in the assassination of US President Abraham Lincoln, but was ultimately cleared of suspicion.
Whoa.
Now, in the early 1860s, Tumblety is alleged to have hosted a lavish dinner party in Washington. Only men were invited to this dinner, and Tumblety had supposedly expressed fierce hatred of women. Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet in his office in which he stored a vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens, some of which were said to contain the wombs of, quote, every class of woman.
Wombs?
In 1869,
Why would
Tumblety
you
ventured
collect
across the Atlantic and
wombs?
visited England for the first time. By his own admission, he roamed the streets of London until he became familiar with every part of it. He advertised himself as the great American doctor and had a few skirmishes with the police. After a few more voyages between the old world and the new, Tumblety found himself in London in the autumn of 1888. The purpose of his visit and whereabouts at the time of the murders are completely unknown. Tumblety never stayed in one place for long and made frequent use of false names. There is a story of a mysterious lodger leaving behind a blood-stained shirt near the murder site of Elizabeth Stride. This supposedly happened on the night of the murder, and some believe that this lodger was Francis Tumblety. But there is no firm evidence of that, and the entire incident is fraught with uncertainty. What we do know is that Tumblety was arrested in London on November the 7th. According to the press, as well as Tumblety himself, he was arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered, and it's unclear whether Tumblety was still in custody or had already been released on bail.
What? How
Nevertheless,
is it
he was ultimately
unclear?
charged with 4 counts of gross indecency, which had nothing to do with the murders. But Tumblety had no intention of standing trial. Instead, he made his way across the English Channel, boarded a steamship under a false name, and fled back to America. He was pursued by detectives and kept under surveillance, but his offenses were, quote, not extraditable. As such, Tumblety remained in the United States and never returned to England. So to recap, Francis Tumblety was a misogynistic medicaster who was in London at the time of the murders. He even showcased a collection of wombs, and the Ripper did indeed extract the womb from 2 of his victims. I mean, he sounds like the perfect suspect.
Yeah.
Perhaps a bit too perfect. There is no doubt that Tumblety was in London in 1888, but the claim that he was a misogynistic collector of human body parts is extremely dubious. It can be traced back to a single article from December of 1888, featuring an interview with a man named Charles Dunham. Dunham had a long history of spreading misinformation and has been described as a pathological liar, a forger, and a conman. He was even convicted of perjury. As such, there is every reason to believe that this story is a complete fabrication.
Yeah. He never had any collection jars of
Tumblety was both older and
a collection
than
of
the
jars
man
with
described by most
women's
witnesses.
wombs.
Tumblety was said to be, quote, an enormous man who liked to dress in flamboyant and militaristic outfits. It's difficult to imagine a tall, pompous American sneaking around the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected. On the other hand, it's unclear which, if any, of the witness accounts can be trusted. Then there's the matter of the rings. You may recall that 2 brass rings were stolen from the body of Annie Chapman. It's suspected that the rings were taken by the Ripper to be kept as trophies. Now, upon his death in 1903, Tumblety left behind a quite impressive estate. But among his many valuable possessions were a pair of inexpensive imitation rings. Could they have been the same rings taken from the body of Chapman?
I highly doubt that.
It's possible. It's also impossible to prove.
Yeah. I highly doubt that.
Chief Inspector John Littlechild regarded Tumblety as a, quote, very likely suspect. And it's not difficult to see why. If the many rumors about him are to be believed, Tumblety had both opportunity and motive to commit the murders. But therein lies the problem. Much of what we know about Tumblety is founded upon unsubstantiated rumors. Tumblety himself was an attention-seeking charlatan with no qualms about lies and deception.
Yeah.
With a suspect like that, one can never be certain where the lies end and the truth begins.
That's the problem. He's very much correct. Tumblety is a liar. The one quoted for the article was also a liar, so that just muddies the water even more. So we'll never really know who the real suspect is.
To theorize about the identity of Jack the Ripper is to navigate a minefield of hearsay, sophistry, and contradictions. Entire encyclopedias have been dedicated to the compilation of suspects, and with every passing year, they seem to grow ever more expansive. Even though there are hundreds of potential suspects, only a dozen or so are worth more than a brief consideration. Some of the more sensational contenders include famous authors and artists, as well as high-ranking officers and members of the royal family. But these grand conspiracies and elaborate deceptions seem hopelessly contrived against the sheer simplicity of a suspect like Charles Lechmere, an unassuming delivery man on his way to work. Personally, I remain unconvinced that Jack the Ripper has even been identified as a suspect. The few covered in this video are probable candidates, but it's still possible to make persuasive arguments against them. The same is true of all those left out by necessity. None of them can offer anything more than ambiguity and circumstance. With a suspect pool in the hundreds, that might seem improbable. But London was the largest city in the world, home to the largest port in the world. It was a city of millions, with a large population of poorly documented drifters. It's not difficult to imagine one lowly sailor, butcher, medic, soldier, barber, merchant, porter, blending into the slums of Whitechapel like a grain of sand.
Yeah. Oh, that's another good video from Lemmino. Yeah, that was the mystery of Jack the Ripper by Lemmino. That's such a good video, man. Very well researched, and it's just incredible, really. The editing was great, the music was great. Still, I gotta commend the amount of research that he puts in his videos. I mean, I used to do a lot of research back in the day. Not scientific research, just research in general, especially when it comes to like school projects. So I know a good deal of how hard it is to research just even a single topic down to the bone. So yeah, I gotta commend him for that. And as usual, it's really a good video, albeit depressing, uh, especially for the victims, but a great video nonetheless. Man, somebody should get this guy a documentary crew because it is just that good. But yeah, there's not much really to be said apart from Jack the Ripper is, I mean, unless if we invent time travel and go back to those specific dates and really witness the murder, then we'll probably never know who it is. So yeah, he just got away, blending into the streets like Lemmino said, just like a grain of sand. Oh man. But yeah, don't forget, if you haven't seen it already, go ahead and check out part 1. It will be linked down in the description, down in the pinned comment, as well as an iCard here. So yeah, go ahead and check it out if you haven't already. And yeah, that's gonna be it for me today, guys. Link to my Twitter is down in the description below. Go ahead and check it out if you want to. And if you're new here and enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. Let me know your thoughts on the video down in the comment section below and consider subscribing. Also, don't forget to leave your suggestions on what I should check out next, anime or YouTube video. That being said, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you all next time. Bye!